This is not sport mode. This is comfy mode, sit on the couch, sleeping mode. I'm gonna show you the process of sewing this massive cloth pad. It's got a lot of coverage. It snaps at 4 inches wide. It's got settings for 4 different width options that it'll snap at, from 9 inches to 26 inches long. What you're looking at is just my test print before I finished digitizing the whole pattern, but if you want to see the final pattern printed and modified and assembled, that'll be at the end of this whole video. So I spritzed the back of my pattern piece with a little bit of basting spray so that it wouldn't shift around while I was tracing the sewing line onto my flannel. I used the flannel layer to attach the absorbent core to, instead of attaching it directly to my topper. I just like this, but it's not necessary. You don't have to do it like this. And then I just roughly cut out the moisture barrier fabric, and then I think I took about 5 whole minutes to decide the placement of the topper, because this fabric there were so many options for good placement and cutting. And then I cut my pattern down so that it just had the core shape, since I don't plan on using this exact shape again. And since it's spritzed, then it's not moving around on the Zorb absorbent fabric. That's hard to say. So I just cut that out with my rotary cutter, and I had this scrap piece here that I decided to use as a booster section in the middle of the core. I ended up cutting it down a little bit so it wasn't quite as wide as the first layer. You don't have to have like a pattern for this. You can just cut out a scrap that looks like it'll fit in the middle of the pad. That's fine. So I'm getting all set up here. I back stitch in order to lock in my stitches, and then I'm attaching the Zorb core to the hidden layer of flannel. I just do a straight stitch all the way around the edge of the core. Some people do a wavy stitch, which is very decorative on the topper, which is nice. And I'm attaching the booster section. You could attach the booster to the other layer of the core before attaching it to the hidden layer, but it doesn't really matter which way you do it. Whatever way you like is good. So I'm basting the core to the topper, put that onto the back of the topper layer, and then we are layering everything to sew together. You place right sides together, so the outsides need to be facing each other before you sew on the sewing line. This is called the turn and top stitch method of sewing a pad. Some people use a serger and just overlock the edges, but that's not what we're doing today. We're going to have that be the turning hole. So I'm going to start at the turning hole and not sew that part shut. Back stitching to lock in the stitches, and then I position the needle directly on that line that I drew. Some people like to use the seam allowance as the guide, so they'll have the edge of the seam allowance running along the edge of their presser foot. I don't do that because I find that my shape gets a little wonky like that. So I just rough cut the layers out and have a drawn line that I sew directly on. I think that the pad shape is more accurate that way. And then you don't have to worry about cutting so many layers exactly right. And I'll end up trimming off the seam allowance anyway with pinking shears, so I feel like it just saves me time. Okay, so this pad was so big, it was a little bit extra work to keep it from getting stuck in my little sewing machine neck area. This is what my pinking shears look like. They're very cheap from Amazon. I think they were like $7 or $9. I can't remember. Don't go get the expensive kind locally in store because they don't even work and they're really expensive. So I think I have them linked in my sewing videos if you want to grab these. They're very durable and cut through several thick layers of fabric. When you get to the turning hole, when you're trimming, leave that tab a little longer so that when you're top stitching, you'll be able to catch those flaps and sew them down. You do need to trim it down a little bit so that there's not a big bulge, but leave it longer than the rest of the seam allowance. I did trim pretty close with the pinking shears, but I'm still going to go through with my little scissors and cut off the bulk around the sharp corners so that there's not going to be a bulge when I turn the pad right side out. Be careful not to get too close to the sewn line because you don't want it to fray or or cut the stitches. And this is probably a little unnecessary since I already trimmed it with the pinking shears, but if you had a more seam allowance left over, this would be important so that your pad wouldn't pucker when you turn it right side out. You want to release that tension so that everything can lay flat before you top stitch it. I like to crinkle the pad a little bit before I turn it out. For smaller pads that have a tiny turning hole, it's helpful to smush it so that the fabric is more flexible. And then I use a long knitting needle to help me poke out all the corners and the seams and get it looking nice and neat before I top stitch. So I spend a bit of time getting the turning hole just in the right position, because as soon as you sew that down, it's going to be stuck that way forever, and I want it to look nice. So that's the first thing I do, is I sew the turning hole shut when I'm top stitching. I kind of wish I had top stitched further away from the edge of the pad. It's a little easier to make it look nice when you're sewing fuzzy fabrics like this, OBV, Sherpa, anything that's thick and fuzzy. Sew the top stitching line further from the edge of the pad than you would if you were doing like quilter's cotton or a smooth knit fabric. It's easier to sew that way and it looks neater. So yeah, I just keep going around. These sharp inner curves were a little tricky because I haven't been sewing a whole lot lately, but just lift the presser foot a lot and pivot the whole thing. Don't try to go around those curves like at speed, like muscling your way through it and manipulating the fabric. I'm gonna fold the wings over to the position I want them to be in and then use my poking tool to make holes in the wings exactly in this position. And then I'm gonna use plastic cam snaps as my closure option. So I install those with my little press. You can also get a handheld press that's cheaper. This is the Epic pad pattern, completely assembled without any modifications. Requires 5 pages, 2 for the flare there, and then 2 down here, and then 1 for the wings. You can choose wing option you want to use. There are options that are not so long in the middle, but you can also just use this, and if this ends up looking too long, then you just like cut in the middle and then just overlap it, move it up and shorten it, and then tape it back together. Fine. But I included the printed pages for people who don't want to modify it. If you decide that 4-inch snapped is too big for you, then just decide which lines you want to use and highlight those. Okay, I've cut out the basic shape. Now I'm going to remove the center area. You can cut like up the center twice, but you can also just cut once and then overlap them and tape them into place. So I'm gonna overlap to the same line and then tape that in place. And there it is, a 3-inch snapped width pad. So at the moment it is 18 inches long. I don't think I quite need that much, so I'm going to make it a little shorter. You can just use the provided wings that are not so long, or you can split it in the middle and measure how much you want to shorten it. That works just fine. I hope that this demo was helpful. If you need other help or have questions, check out the Facebook group.